The PGA Tour arrived at Riviera Country Club for the 2026 Genesis Invitational with enormous expectations. A world-class field, a $20 million purse, and one of the most historic venues in professional golf. But instead of all the attention staying on the battle between the game's biggest stars, an unexpected controversy quickly became one of the biggest talking points of the week. Rory McIlroy, one of the most influential players on the PGA Tour, was asked about changes made to the Riviera course, and his response immediately raised eyebrows. The tournament was already significant because Riviera was celebrating its 100th playing of the event and its own centennial, but the decision to dramatically alter one of its most difficult holes created a completely different conversation around the tournament. The biggest issue centered around the par 3 fourth hole. Traditionally, the fourth at Riviera has been one of those holes that tests a player's imagination, precision, and ability to control a golf ball under pressure. For the 2026 event, however, the hole was lengthened dramatically, moving from roughly 230 yards to around 273 yards. That is not a small adjustment for a par 3, especially on a hole where the green itself creates another layer of difficulty. Suddenly, players were being asked to hit a much longer shot into a demanding target, and the change immediately became a subject of debate among some of the biggest names in the field. And then came Rory McIlroy's reaction. Rather than simply accepting the change as another challenge from tournament officials, McIlroy openly questioned whether the modification actually improved the hole. He described it as a horrible change, explaining that the additional yardage created a problem because of the relationship between the tee shot, the green, and the surrounding grass. His criticism was not simply that the hole had become harder. Professional golfers expect difficult courses. His argument was that the extra length could make the hole less strategic and more dependent on simply trying to hit a long shot onto a difficult green. That distinction is extremely important because Riviera is famous for strategic golf. This is not supposed to be a course where every challenge is solved by simply hitting the ball as hard as possible. The architecture forces players to think. Angles matter. Positioning matters. The shape of shots matters. And the famous greens can punish even the smallest mistake. That is why McIlroy's criticism carries so much weight. He was essentially questioning whether the new version of the fourth hole was preserving the strategic identity that made Riviera special in the first place. McIlroy was not alone in having concerns. Other leading players also expressed reservations about the change, with Collin Morikawa describing the challenge in terms that suggested the hole could become more of a hit and hope situation. J.J. Spaun also joined the discussion, showing that this was not simply one superstar complaining about a difficult hole. Several players appeared to be questioning whether the modification produced the kind of competitive test that a signature PGA Tour event should want. And that is where the larger PGA Tour story begins. The Tour is currently going through one of the most important periods of change in its history. Professional golf has been dealing with the impact of live golf, changes to tournament structures, questions about player participation, and the future direction of the schedule. In June 2026, the PGA Tour announced an enormous structural overhaul that will introduce a two-tier competitive model beginning in 2028. The Championship Series is expected to feature approximately 23 to 24 elite events, while a Challenger Series will provide a pathway for players to earn promotion into the top level. Rory McIlroy has already been an important voice in those conversations. Despite previously expressing concerns about the possibility of dividing the tour into separate levels, he ultimately described the newly announced changes as a positive step for professional golf. His position was that the sport needed to move forward after years of uncertainty and division. That makes his reaction to the Genesis changes even more interesting. McIlroy clearly understands that professional golf has to evolve, but his comments also suggest that evolution cannot simply mean making everything harder or more complicated. Changes need to make sense for players, fans, and the competitive integrity of the game. The fourth hole controversy therefore became much bigger than one hole at Riviera. It represented a question that the PGA Tour will continue to face over the next several years. How much should traditional golf courses be changed to meet the demands of modern professionals? Equipment has changed. Players hit the ball farther. Athletic preparation has transformed. Technology has dramatically improved. And tournament organizers constantly have to find ways to prevent elite players from overwhelming historic courses. But the solution is not always simply adding yardage. Riviera itself provides the perfect example. The course already has a reputation for being incredibly demanding despite not relying heavily on water hazards or out-of-bounds areas. Players can feel comfortable standing on the first tee, only to discover over the course of 18 holes that the design is constantly asking difficult questions. Even Scottie Scheffler has described Riviera as a course that can gradually eat away at a player's confidence because of its subtle tricks and demanding features. McIlroy's argument was essentially that the fourth hole already had enough difficulty. Extending it by more than 40 yards did not necessarily create a better test. Instead, it could create a situation where even the world's best players are struggling to control a long iron into a green that was not designed for that type of approach. That becomes especially complicated when course conditions are soft. Soft greens can remove some of the traditional strategic elements of a hole because the ball does not react in the same way it would on a firm surface. The weather only added another layer to the debate. Rain softened Riviera during the opening round, creating conditions that made the course play differently from how it might under firmer conditions. McIlroy himself had discussed the wet conditions before the tournament, explaining that they would influence how players approach the course. When a course is soft, a long par 3 can become a very different challenge. Instead of using the contours and ground around the green, players may be forced to rely almost entirely on carrying the ball to the target. That is why the criticism from McIlroy and other players became so fascinating. They were not asking for an easy golf course. Nobody in a $20 million signature event expects that. Instead, they were questioning whether difficulty alone should be the goal. The best tournament holes usually reward good decisions and punish bad ones. They give players multiple ways to attack. They create risk and reward. And they allow different styles of golfers to succeed. If the only realistic strategy becomes hitting a massive iron toward a difficult target and hoping for the best, some players believe the architecture loses part of its purpose. Despite all the controversy, McIlroy showed that he was still capable of producing the kind of golf expected from one of the biggest stars in the world. In the opening round, he shot a 5 under 66 and placed himself near the top of the leaderboard. That performance was particularly impressive considering the conditions and the attention surrounding the course changes. McIlroy's strong start demonstrated that he was not allowing the controversy to distract him from the actual tournament. The tournament also featured Scottie Scheffler, Ludwig Aberg, Collin Morikawa, Tommy Fleetwood, and many other elite players, making the Genesis Invitational one of the strongest fields of the season. The event was officially one of the PGA Tour's signature events, carrying a $20 million purse and attracting the biggest names in golf. That level of competition means every design decision receives additional scrutiny because small changes can have enormous consequences when the world's best players are competing. And there was another interesting element surrounding McIlroy. At this stage of his career, he is no longer simply another player on the leaderboard. His opinions carry influence across the sport. He has repeatedly spoken about the future of professional golf, the relationship between players and tour leadership, and the need to make the sport more attractive to fans. With Brian Rolapp preparing to become PGA Tour Commissioner in 2027 and the tour preparing for its new competitive structure in 2028, McIlroy is likely to remain one of the players. Should strategy take priority over raw difficulty? How much influence should the players have? And can the PGA Tour modernize without losing the character that made its greatest venues legendary? Those questions are not going away. If anything, they are only going to become more important as the PGA Tour approaches its next major transformation. And if Rory McIlroy continues to speak openly about the decisions shaping the sport, expect his voice to remain one of the loudest in professional golf. The Genesis Invitational may have been played over 4 rounds at Riviera, but the debate it sparked could last much longer. For the PGA Tour, that may be the real warning. Changing golf is easy. Changing it without losing what makes it great is the difficult part.